When we began this series at the beginning of the month, I brought up Bree's nativity set. It's one of the most important pieces of Christmas decoration that we have, and it's because it's the clearest representation of what this season is about. And so when Bree puts it together, she really gives it the attention that it deserves. It's right there on the mantle when you walk into our living room. And Bree does not throw anything together willy-nilly. You probably know this about her, but she doesn't just throw stuff up there. No, she sets it all in the right place. She makes sure it's spaced correctly, and then she steps back and she looks at it again, and then she moves back, and every piece is in just the right place that it is supposed to be. By the time that this process is over, each piece is carefully placed to create one cohesive display of the Messiah coming into the world and what we celebrate Christmas, what we celebrate this time of the year before. And as I was considering this sermon series and how it's gone so far and where we're going to wind up next week, I thought about each of the characters and kind of where they are placed in this story. In week one, we talked about the prophets, and if you remember, the prophets were unplaced. They're not really usually considered part of the Christmas story, and I've never seen a prophet in a nativity scene, but they're unplaced, but they're a big part of the Christmas story. They play a big role. Last week, we talked about Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph are properly placed in this story. Mary and Joseph, of course, they're part of everyone's depiction of the Christmas story, and they're part of every nativity set. The nativity set that Bree has, I think it's called Willow Tree or Willow Creek or Willow Stone. There's something about a willow in there for sure. But when we first started looking at these pieces, the first piece that she wanted was called the starter set. And the starter set is only Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus. They are at the pinnacle of the story. They're the most important. So if they're in the Christmas story, they are properly placed. If they're in your nativity, they are properly placed. Well, today we're going to discover a little bit about the wise men, or the magi is maybe what you call them, who are most often misplaced. And you might be saying, well, what do you mean they're misplaced? They're part of my nativity. They're part of most nativities and most Christmas programs. And that's kind of exactly what I mean when I say that they are misplaced. And please don't understand me. If your nativity set has the wise men, you're not a heretic. Our nativity set has the wise men. But if we want to be biblically and historically accurate about the wise men, they don't belong in the nativity set. They don't belong in our Christmas programs the way that we normally depict them. There are several misconceptions about the wise men that we have just kind of accepted as truth, but honestly, we've gotten there because of tradition. And the first misconception is that they were at the place where Jesus was born. They were at the barn. But the truth is they were not there. They were not there on that night. They were not there at the manger scene. But if they weren't there, then why are they included in this story? Why do we talk about them so much? And why are they a part of your nativity set? Well, the wise men's inclusion in the Christmas story comes from the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 2. And if you've got a Bible and you want to turn over to Matthew chapter 2, we're going to be kind of jumping all around those first 12 verses for the next little while. Matthew chapter 2 verse 11 says, "And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother." So here's our first indication that the wise men did not come to Jesus' place of birth. What did it say that they went into? It said they went into a barn, a cave that housed animals. No, it says they went into the house, and that's where they found Jesus. And before we begin speculating that it may have just been a structure of unknown type, the original Greek really doesn't leave any room for an interpretation to the word except that it was a house. Now, it's fair to say that we don't know how long they were in the stable before they got to the house. They may have had to wait for the census to be over, and so there was more room. Or maybe somebody came along and just had pity on this family because no family with a newborn child needs to be sleeping out in a barn. Either way, there's good indication that the wise men did not show up to Bethlehem for a considerable amount of time after Jesus was born. And now any guess to the exact timing is a speculation, but let's try to piece some things together and try to at least understand the story a little bit better. In verse 1 of chapter 2, it tells us that the wise men showed up to Jerusalem and they found Herod. And here's what it says in verse 2. It says, the wise men asked, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" They're asking this to Herod. "We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." So they saw this star that showed up when Jesus was born, and they came to worship him. And we'll get a little bit more into this in just a moment, but these guys came from, the place that these guys came from, it would have taken a minimum of 35 days to travel there. Most scholars believe it was actually probably even a little bit longer than that. So based off of that knowledge, if the star appeared upon the birth of Christ, which is what most people believe happened, this is at least 35 days after Jesus was born. So we've got they came into a house. We've got the wise men came when the star was born. It's 35 days later. But again, that's not the only indicator we have. Over in Luke chapter 2, there's a narrative about the purification ritual that Mary went through. The purification ritual typically was 41 days after a male child was born. And part of the purification ritual involved the sacrifice of a lamb and a dove or a pigeon. It's either a lamb and one of these two birds. But there was a special rider in there. If this family did not have means to purchase a lamb or did not have means to provide a lamb, then they could provide two of the birds instead. Well, we know from Luke chapter 2 that they went with the two birds. This means that they did not have the money to purchase a lamb, or they did not have a lamb available to them. The wise men, we know, brought with them 3 very expensive gifts. Mary and Joseph clearly had not received these gifts before the purification ritual on day 41, or they would have been able to provide a lamb, not just these 2 birds. So there's at least 41 days. But that's still not the only indication we have that the wise men showed up significantly later than what our traditions lead us to believe. When the wise men showed up in Matthew chapter 2 and they begin to talk to Herod, he is concerned about this because currently he is the king over the Jews. And he is threatened by anyone who might try to come in and overtake his power. So after he is visited with some of the Jewish priests and the people that he wants to talk about, and they share with him about what the prophet Malachi said about the baby is born to be born in Bethlehem, he goes to the wise men and he inquires to them. Verse 7 of Matthew chapter 2 says, "Then Herod summoned the wise men in secret and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared." He wanted to know, when did the star show up? Exactly when did this star come to place? So Herod knows where the star was at, or where Jesus is to be born, because he talked to the Jewish priests. He talked about the prophets. He knows when the star first appeared because the wise men told him. So he knows when and where this child who might overthrow his power was born. And he sends the wise men on their way, but he tells them, hey, after you get done worshiping him, will you please come back here because I would like to go worship him as well. But after they visit Jesus, they receive a dream warning them, don't go back through Jerusalem. Don't go back and talk to Herod. Go a different way. Don't even talk to him. And so that's what they do. They go a different way, not to give any information to Herod. And Matthew chapter 2:16 says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men." So Herod knows when the star first appeared, and he knows that this child has been prophesied to set the Israelite people free. He does not want to lose his authority or his power over the people, so he sends out an order to go to Bethlehem to kill every child under a certain age. He uses the information that he got from the wise men about when the star first appeared and says, This is what we're doing. We're killing all the little boys under the age of 2 years old. So by this math, the wise men could have visited Jesus as much to 2 years after he was actually born. So whether it was 35 days or 41 days or 2 years or somewhere in like 15 to 16 months is what I kind of believe. We don't know, but it also doesn't matter. What we know is that the wise men, they did not show up and see baby Jesus lying in the manger. They are misplaced in our nativity sets. Now, I'm sorry if I just ruined Christmas for all of you. I'm sorry if, like, when you were a child, you were the wise men, and now you're like, my whole childhood is a lie. They gave me that part because they needed somebody to fill a costume, but it's a lie. Well, another misconception about the wise men is that there were 3 of them. This might be true. We just don't know. That number 3 that we have traditionally given, it comes from the number of gifts that they brought. But nowhere in the Scripture does it say how many of them there were. Some people believe that there were as many as 12. What we know is that in Matthew 2:1, it uses the plural to indicate that there were multiple, so there's at least 2, but there's nothing that indicates that there was only 3. It could have been 2, it could have been a dozen, it could have been 100. We just don't know. I will say that given the route that these guys took to get over here, over that 35-plus day adventure, it is highly unlikely that they traveled alone. No matter how many wise men were there, we can be fairly certain that they brought an entourage with them that just helped them on their journey to Bethlehem. These were high-ranking officials in their land, and they would have had people to come along to help them with the basic necessities of their journey. They would have had people that came along to help them cook, and people that came along to help them set up camp and tear down camp. They would have had people that came along just to help them care for all of the animals that they brought on this trip. So this was probably a pretty large group, no matter how many wise men there were. And then finally, before we get more into who they were and what I really want you guys to know about the wise men, the last misconception that I want to point you out is this common belief that these guys were kings. In fact, we even have legends that give these kings names and countries that they might have come from. I don't know where that tradition originated, but where we mostly have kind of come up with it today in 2024 is this old Christmas song called "We Three Kings of Orient Are." That's where people get the idea that these guys were kings. It's not a scriptural basis. It's a really catchy Christmas tune. I like singing it, but it doesn't indicate that these guys were kings, and that's the only place we have that idea. So at this point, we've sorted out some misconceptions about what we do know about who the wise men are not, but who are they? And why are they such a big part of the story of the Jewish Messiah? I think, as I have studied this over the last week, that the wise men are one of the most interesting storylines of the Nativity. One of the most interesting storylines of this. And all we've talked about so far is how they weren't really at the birth and how we don't know how many there were and how they weren't actually kings. None of that is really that important. What is important is that this group of people, they came to recognize the child Jesus as the new king, and they came because they wanted to worship him. Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1, says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And they said, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him.'" And there's a really important phrase there that I want to spend some time unpacking, and it's that the wise men came from the east. If you look at a map of this part of the world during the first century and for centuries before that, what you recognize is that directly to the east, if this is Israel, directly to the east is the Arabian desert. We call it the Arabian Peninsula now. Nobody lived there. They didn't come from the Arabian desert. Just to the east of that is 2 countries that play a pretty big, significant role in biblical history, Babylon and Persia. In Babylon and Persia, wise men were highly esteemed individuals. They were highly respected, and they would often be called upon by the king to make decisions, to seek counsel, to seek wise counsel. Well, in the book of Daniel, the nation of Israel is captured and overturned by Babylon, and many of the Israelites are forced to come to Babylon and live among the Babylonians. They are forced to become a part of the Babylonian culture and Babylonian society. And there was one young Israelite whose name was Daniel, who the book was named after, who he found favor with the Babylonian king who was named Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that disturbed him, and he called all of his council, all of his wise men to help him interpret the dream. That's the type of thing that he would do. When he had a dream, when he needed help interpreting something, or when he needed help making decisions, he would call his wise men together and they would help him through this situation. Well, unfortunately, in this instance, none of them could do it. They said, we don't know what this means. But Daniel, this Israelite man, was called upon, and he interpreted the dream. And King Nebuchadnezzar was grateful for Daniel, and he recognized the wisdom that he had, and so he gave him a promotion. Daniel 2:48 says, "Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts." And this is the important part, though. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And so Daniel, who is an upright Israelite, who knows the Torah, he knows its prophecies, he himself is anticipating the Messiah about whom these prophecies are written, is now in charge of the wise men of Babylon. He now has the listening ear of the wise men of at the time, the most powerful country in the world. He now has significant influence over the wise men of Babylon. He has the ability to choose the curriculum that these guys are going to live by for generation to generation. Now, these events took place in the year 605 BC. Less than 100 years later, in the year 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by Persia. Persia similarly used wise men to aid the king in making decisions. Daniel, he kept his office. That's unheard of, that people that were high-ranking officials in Babylon get to keep their office when they've been conquered by another country. But Daniel gets to keep his office, and he gets to continue to have authority over the wise men here in Persia. Daniel and the wise men of that day obviously died eventually, but not before they significantly impacted the way that the next generation of wise men thought and that they learned. And although Persia adopted Zoroastrianism as its official state religion, there were at least remnants of these wise men who held on to the prophecies that they had been taught by Daniel. Well, as time went on, a couple of things happened. First, the wise men became really interested in astronomy, and they became experts in it. They were the leading experts in astronomy in the world at that time, at this time in history. They studied the stars, and they recorded everything that they saw. If a star moved 1 mile to the east, they recorded it. They wrote it down. They thought that significant historical and political events happened, that when those things happened, that they needed to pay attention to what was happening in the stars, because they believed that astronomy and the stars played a significant role in world events. And then secondly, the wise men, or the Greek word is magoi, became a political class of sorts. In times before, the wise men were respected enough that the leaders, the king, would seek counsel from them. They would seek wisdom from them, and they would be under their advisement as they made decisions. Eventually, however, they became an official ruling class who made laws and who held up the final authority of one pretty significant decision: who would become king in those countries. And even though the Persian Empire had fallen to Greece and the Greek Empire had fallen to Rome, who was the major world empire at the time of the birth of Jesus, the wise men from the East, they still garnered respect from leaders all around the world, including Herod. So these guys, however many they were, they had been watching this star, and suddenly a new star appears off to their west. And they remember the teachings of Daniel. They remember the prophecies that Daniel told them about, that a star was going to show up. In fact, they had been anticipating and waiting for this star to show up. Numbers 24:17 says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel. And so this group of men who are king makers, they see this new star, and they think this must be significant. This must be important. It is significant enough that they assemble a caravan with gifts in hand, and they head to see this new king of the Jews. And now I don't think, as some have suggested, that this star just went before them and was like the thing they followed. That doesn't make a lot of sense. On this particular trip, the way that they would have gone, if this was a map, and I tried to find a map to put up, is if Persia and Babylon are here and Bethlehem is here, well, in between you've got the Arabian desert. Nobody's taking a trek across the Arabian desert. Even though that's a straight shot that they could probably, like perfect conditions, do it really quickly, they went up and around through Jerusalem where they saw King Herod, and that's where they wound up. This was a significant trip, and it was not a straight shot. The star did not do the horseshoe with them, but they saw this star, they saw the direction that it was, and they thought, this is significant. We remember hearing about a star. We probably need to get to Israel. We probably need to get to Jerusalem and see what's going on. Well, they arrive at Jerusalem and they find Herod and they ask him if he knows anything about this. Do you know where this child is, the new king of the Jews? Do you know where he's at? And this was Herod's response in chapter 3. It says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. So Herod knew who this group was. These wise men, they had a reputation, and it was a positive reputation. So Herod knew who this was. He knew what the wise men were. He knew that they were king makers. So he was troubled. If these guys had shown up, something was certainly on the horizon that might threaten his role and might threaten his power and might threaten his authority. So of course he was troubled. But it says that all of Jerusalem was troubled also. The holy city was troubled. Why were they troubled? Wasn't this their Messiah that the wise men came to see and worship? Shouldn't it bring joy and excitement? But no, it says that they were troubled. And I have some ideas. I don't know why, but I have some ideas. First, I think the reality of another dynasty turnover was probably just too much. Israel had been through this for centuries after centuries, for year after year. They'd get turned over from one dynasty to another, and each time they had to adapt to new cultural norms while wondering if their beliefs and if their way of life was going to be okay or if it was going to be threatened. And Herod was a bad king who made their lives difficult. But his title given by the Roman overlords, who were the authorities of Israel at this time, his title that was given to him by Rome was King of the Jews. How did the Israelites know, how did they know that this wasn't just another one of those situations where they were just going to get turned over to another dynasty or get turned over to another self-proclaimed king that in reality was not very good for them? I think that the other possibility is that this, again, I don't believe this was just three wise men on camels. I think this was a whole bunch of people who were riding Persian steeds, and they were with them people carrying wagons and people carrying other chariots and other horse-drawn carriages. I think that this was not just three people rolling into the biggest city in the area that is insignificant. I think this was a pretty big deal. When people come in, you're a little concerned about what might be going on. What are these people doing here? So Herod then, out of his fear and his troubling spirit, he calls together his own council. He's like, I got to figure out what's going on. These guys, they know what's going on, but I need to figure out something. I'm threatened right now. So it says that he assembles, and this is verse 4, he assembles all the chief priests and scribes of the people, and he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. This group that he calls together consisted of people who knew the Torah well. They tell him about the prophecy in Malachi, and Herod sends the wise men on their way to Bethlehem with instructions. Hey, when you worship him, come back here and tell me about it, because I want to go worship him also. And it picks up in verse 9. At this point, I do believe that once they start making their way from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, I do believe that at this point the star does start acting as a bit of a navigational beacon for them. It says, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasure, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So the star guides them to the place where Jesus is, and they went in and they gave him two really important things. First, they gave him their worship. Above all else, they worshiped the king. These guys had the responsibility to install new kings of the east. They recognized a king when they saw one. And they immediately recognized that this child, even though it's just a child, is the new king of the Jews. And I think they even recognize he's king of a lot more than the Jews. And then secondly, they gave him some gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And now the gifts had ceremonial significance of why they gave them, but they also had practical significance. Gold was recognized as the only gift worthy to give a king. What do you give a king? What do you get? Like you give something to your dad on Father's Day, a new tie or whatever, and that's great. You're not going to give the king a new tie. This says it'll be a significant gift. And so they gave him gold. It is a gift of respect. We respect this person. They gave him frankincense. Frankincense was burned in the temple at times of worship. This was a gift of worship. And then finally they gave him myrrh, which was used in the process of embalming someone, the process of when they died. This was a foreshadow of the sacrifice that this child was going to make. The myrrh was a gift of gratitude. More practically, however, these gifts were of great value. And as you continue reading on in Matthew chapter 2, you see that Joseph and Mary and Jesus, they had to flee to Egypt for an extended amount of time so that they could be away from Herod, because Herod was going to kill all the babies. Joseph was going to be out of work for quite some time. So these gifts likely helped to support him and his family while they were in Egypt. Now, I hope that you have enjoyed learning all these historical things with me. I have nerded out all week over this sermon. I'm like, they're either going to love it or they're going to be bored out of their gourd. This was one of the more interesting sermons that I've written. But there are also a couple of really important spiritual truths and spiritual realities that I want for you to recognize from the wise men. First, recognize this: God is always working, even if you can't see it, even if it feels like he's not present. The Israelites were captured by Babylon 600 years before Jesus was born. 600 years, 6 centuries. Almost twice as long as we have been a country. I think my history might be wrong on American history. Over twice as long as we have been a country, Israelites are captured by Babylon. And I assure you that this was not a pleasant experience for the Israelites. As I have studied what living in Babylon was like for the Israelites, I've come to discover that it was just awful. It was just terrible. The things that we as Christians think of in America, that, oh, we just have to contend with this and that in our faith. It's just really hard to be a Christian in America because of this and that. It would be a walk in the park for the Israelites living in Babylon. It was a lot worse situation for them than what we have right now as Christians in America. So I know that they hated it. But in the midst of their turmoil, God was writing history. He was putting Daniel in places to influence people who would listen and internalize his teaching, who would pass it down for centuries to these men, these kingmakers, who would show up to worship the King of Kings, who would take the word of him back to the east, back to the Gentiles, and they provided him with some resources that was going to keep him alive in Egypt. We may not think of these gifts as that significant, but these gifts kept the Messiah, the King of the world, alive while he had to flee to Egypt. You might be in a difficult season of life right now. But I promise you, if you will just hold your life in your hands as an offering to the Lord, he can take that season and he can ordain it for his glory and for his kingdom expansion. You might not ever see it. It might be 600 years before it makes any kind of significant impact on the world. But God is always working in and through his people. And years or decades or centuries may go by, but God will surely build something from the ashes if we'll just trust him. And then secondly, I want you to recognize that Jesus is the King for everyone. He's not just the King of the Jews. This is the message in the beginning of Matthew, and it continues throughout Matthew and the other Gospels and the entire New Testament. While many in that day would have said that Jesus was only the king who only came to liberate and free those of Hebraic descent, that is not the reason that Jesus came. Jesus came for all men in every place, in every time. And I like looking at the contrast here between the Jews who believed that they were the only people found in God's favor and these Gentile wise men. The Jews were deeply troubled at the sign. The Greek word used here isn't to suggest a negative emotion that you can just work through with positive thoughts and good vibes. This was a deep, deep agony that was fueled by fear. These wise men, on the other hand, it says in verse 10 that they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. The Jews could not contain their fear over what was going on. The Gentiles could not contain their joy. The Jews who in fact were chief priests, these were like the pastors of the Jews. After telling Herod where the Messiah was, they stayed put. The Gentiles, on the other hand, they went immediately to worship the King. Church, we cannot put Jesus in a box and say that he only came for the ones that we designate worthy. We cannot assume that he only came for who we think he came for. Jesus came to liberate all of humanity from the chains of sin. He came to set all of us free. That means that he came for your worst enemy. That means he came for those who participate in the sins that disgust you and that you hate the most. That means that he came for the people who have personally done you wrong, who have personally hurt you. He came for them. But it also means that he came for you and I. If we write ourselves into this story, we're not the wise men going to seek Jesus. We're the priest who hung around, didn't think it was that big of a deal. We're not the wise men who rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. We're the wise men who were deeply troubled and scared. Jesus came as a baby. He lived a perfect life. He died a prisoner's death. But then he rose as a victor, and he defeated sin for all who will call upon his name and follow him. And church, that should cause us to rejoice with exceedingly great joy. Let's pray.